Hey all, I wanted to make a quick update covering three subjects here. One being this off-grid foundation and Allodium, which it's related to. The second one being Bitcoin Cash and specifically its new upgrade cash tokens. And then the third one being the ongoing, basically escalating World War III. So, starting with the first, I just want to give a general overview because I know that people come to this channel for different reasons because I'm covering different things. And so just a general overview of what this off-grid foundation is, what Allodium is, and how they're related. So this off-grid foundation, I started building off-grid in 2013, or maybe it was 2014. I get the years mixed up. But anyways, it was a barren hill when I got here. There was just no one was using it. It was fallow or not being used by anyone, on the edge of a quarry that was claimed by or was quarried by a town. So after the town quarried out this area, they kind of moved on to another area, and I just kind of set up a living space on the edge of this quarry. And started building with the Earthship style, which is essentially using a lot of recycled materials, primarily tires, ramming those tires with earth so that they become like building blocks. And basically started building with no money because tires are free and it just requires labor, and I use all these recycled materials. And so with no initial investment other than my own effort and labor, I created a structure that sustained me through the first winter, which was my goal. Here in Vermont, there's cold winters, and so you gotta have a good shelter in order to survive the winter. So I figured as long as I could make it through the first winter, then subsequently I could just add on. And that first room, essentially, that first Earthship room would be the foundation to grow upon. And that's what's happened. And it's been 9 full seasons of building now. This will be the 10th season of building. And in that time, that one little Earthship room has grown into basically a fledgling castle, where the idea, and it's on a hilltop, so the idea is basically to make a castle on a hill, this off-grid castle, and it's all there's no licenses or permits or any connection to the control matrix that is the state or the government. And in fact, we've created our own sovereign state, and which is essentially enclaved within Vermont, or Vermont is surrounding, because really Vermont the state used to be Vermont the country, and the country of Vermont precedes the state of Vermont. And anyways, I won't get into all that, but essentially this is its own sovereign state that I have created from scratch, essentially. And I've gotten some help from other people over the years, but the great majority of all of the labor here has been my labor, my investment. And then living here along with me, there's been a number of other people who have lived here over the years, but currently it's me and a bunch of animals, dog and cats and fishes behind me, and chickens, and aiming for sustainability for food production and everything else. It's all solar powered with a little bit of wind, turbine action, and renewable heat source from wood and all that sort of stuff. And so the idea is to create an off-grid foundation, which is what OG Foundation stands for. And a quick tangent, because a lot of people think OG stands for Original Gangster, which in gang culture, that's what OG stands for, and OG is the original gangster. But if you look at cannabis culture, OG stands for original. So if you're looking at a strain of cannabis like OG skunk, it's not that's the original gangster skunk. No, that's just original skunk. So OG can mean original gangster, or it can just mean original, depending on what kind of culture you're referencing. And I also use it. It's an original foundation, but it's also an off-grid foundation. So OG, in this sense, represents this off-grid foundation. And then Allodium is the greater cooperative organization, which is akin to a nation that the physical is staked to, and then in cooperation with other people who have voluntarily chosen to work together and be associated with this. We've created our own jurisdiction, which is also necessary in order to not be subject to another jurisdiction, which we're not subject to, which is why there's no taxes or licenses or permits or any of that kind of stuff. And we have our own jurisprudence, meaning there's been cases in our own jurisdiction that have already been adjudicated and set up the sort of legal precedent for our jurisdiction. So this is, as far as I know, it's the only sovereign state enclave within the wider nation or country that is the United States. And there's like, Vermont is right next to New Hampshire, which has this free state project, and there's a lot of like libertarian type people and freedom oriented people in New Hampshire, and they're aiming towards a similar outcome of a free state, but they're trying to do it within the democratic system, as opposed to just creating a new solution, as has been done here from scratch. So that's about all for OG Foundation and Allodium. There is a website, allodium.is, allodium.is, and there's more information there about all that if you're interested. And there's also there's Telegram groups. I'll link that in the video if you want to communicate and sort of get involved and find out more. You can also join these Telegram groups. There's one for OG Foundation and there's one for Allodium. So the second thing I want to get into, and I think I'll timestamp this, is Bitcoin Cash. And so, general overview, Bitcoin Cash is the version of Bitcoin which is frictionless and can scale to be cash for the whole world. And not just cash, but a cash system, so that it can do all of these functions, utilities, that the financial system currently does, like, for example, a stock exchange or something. And all of these assets which are financialized and have all of these intermediaries which they fulfill a purpose, but ultimately if they can be disintermediated, all the value that they extract from the system stays within the system. So the idea is innovation and greater efficiency, as well as decentralization and empowering individuals to be able to make these financial choices and take these actions without needing to access the intermediary. For example, I can send like a couple $1,000s anywhere in the world instantly, whereas if I didn't have that, I would have to go through like a bank to wire the money, and that would take money. That would be a lot of friction, and it would take time. And so there's a lot of reasons why Bitcoin originally was revolutionary, and why the current Bitcoin BTC is no longer revolutionary because of all the friction. Every transaction costs at least $1, whereas in Bitcoin Cash it's very similar because they're fork of the same original chain, but in Bitcoin Cash it costs less than a cent. So it actually works. It serves that function and is more efficient. And the only reason that Bitcoin has a greater market cap is because of the marketing that has gone into it, not because it has a greater function. So one aspect of Bitcoin Core is it basically is very stagnant. They're emulating gold, which is very stable and kind of stagnant as a store of wealth. So they're trying to compete with gold as opposed to being a currency, which was the original intent of Bitcoin. And that's what Bitcoin Cash is, a currency. And so one of the aspects of Bitcoin Cash is that there's an upgrade cycle. Even though it's all decentralized, this decentralized group of people have figured out a way to upgrade it in 1 year intervals and through a peer review process, essentially, so that it's not centralized in a decentralized way. So in the most recent upgrade of Bitcoin Cash, which will be live in May, but right now it's basically a test version. there's a parallel version which is testing out the upgrades before they go live, so that there's no risk that something could go wrong when the new upgrades go live. So there's a test net for these cash tokens. So the cash tokens are the biggest kind of new upgrade for Bitcoin Cash, which will allow all sorts of assets to be tokenized, as well as all sorts of contracts to exist, all on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain, which is essentially the most secure computer network in the world. The Bitcoin hashing network, which Bitcoin Cash uses the same network as BTC Bitcoin. And so there's a degree of security and incentives that back that security, that cause that utility to be valuable. And then there's a degree of scarcity in the inflation rate, so that already 19 out of 21, more than 19 out of 21 of all of them have been created. And so there's only 2 out of 21 as a ratio, 2 million out of 21. There's less than 2 million left to be created in existence. So as far as the overall inflation in the rest of the history of Bitcoin Cash, it's not going to inflate more than like 10%, and on a yearly rate it's decreasing every year. With the current rate, that's like 1.8% or something. So great fundamentals for the overall supply, and it's all mathematically based and it's transparent. So we're not like waiting for some Fed group to be like, here's how much we're going to create, or the government to run a huge deficit. It just doesn't work like that. So it's an innovation on money, on currency. It's primarily a currency, but assuming money, it can become a money depending on how you treat it, how you define the two, and how it evolves essentially. But in general, Bitcoin Core BTC is more aiming towards money, and BCH Bitcoin Cash is more aiming at currency and cash. But just like the US dollar is seen as money, even though it's just currency, once something, it's somewhat of a psychological aspect of when a currency becomes money, is when people see the currency as having intrinsic value. Even if it doesn't have intrinsic value, if they psychologically believe that the currency has intrinsic value, then they'll treat the currency like money. So what the most recent update is that I want to share in relation to cash tokens is that on this test network of Bitcoin Cash, you might hear the chickens in the background there. It's right above freezing, and they're outside and making noise and stuff. So on this test network, some of the developers, one of them specifically Matthew, I don't know his last name, but he's created a great user interface in order to test out the cash tokens. So I was able to access a faucet on the test net so that I could get some of the test Bitcoin Cash, and then I was able to very, very easily create the 3 different forms of tokens, of cash tokens, which are fungible tokens, non-fungible tokens, and then the other one is like a minting NFT. So it's kind of like a degree of authority within the NFT. So like a minting NFT could mint other NFTs, so that you could have like a category of NFTs. Slightly confusing to try to explain really concisely, but it's super easy to make each of these tokens. And so for a while I was really excited about it, but it's like, well, I don't know how to do all this stuff, or the coding, or how to actually figure out how to make these. But it's just great to see a tool created that makes it so easy to create the cash tokens. And to circle back to Allodium has its own currency called appreciation tokens, and the cash tokens on Bitcoin Cash will allow the appreciation tokens to be hosted on the Bitcoin Cash network. So it will be secure and frictionless, and you can have direct custody of your appreciation tokens. And then there's other aspects of the appreciation tokens are just part of the Allodium protocol, and there's aspects of a credit system and authority within that, which can also be facilitated on the Bitcoin Cash blockchain with the other tokens, with the NFT and the minting NFT, to be able to basically turn that protocol into a rock solid contract. Well, it's not rock solid because it's all digital, but an immutable contract that is decentralized and trustless. So that will be a huge upgrade of the Allodium economy. And currently it is centralized and requires myself to facilitate the protocol manually. And it'll be great once it can get to the point where that's not necessary, because that will also create a degree of trust and just greater utility in the whole Allodium economy. And the idea there is that it's just its own economy with its own products that you can buy, and the idea is to just grow the economy, just like any country would want to develop their own economy and increase the circulation of their currency and the productivity and produce available in that economy and everything. So that's just a big update. I was able to do that on my own, and I'm basically I have no coding experience or kind of like any of that really technological stuff. So I've been able to, as generally kind of like a layman just following along, I've been able to access these new features in a very easy way. So I'm very confident that come May, when this new Cash token upgrade goes live on the main net for Bitcoin Cash, that these tools will be available and easy to use for the average person to create their own tokens and contracts. So that's all great and exciting news for Bitcoin Cash. And then the third subject I want to focus on, I don't really know what I want to say about it, but essentially the escalating world war that's going on. The latest big revelation from Seymour Hersh that kind of detailed how the U.S. In an act of terrorism blew up the major infrastructure pipeline that Western Europe was reliant upon for energy. So the U.S., it's kind of just out in the open now how the U.S. is terrorizing its allies. And most people know that the U.S. is the biggest supporter of terrorism in the world, and that the war on terror was actually a war of terror. And the U.S. is terrorizing countries throughout the world with all these military bases and hundreds of thousands of bombs that they're dropping. And just why the U.S. is the most hated country in the world, because of all of this imperialism, this empire, and aggression and warfare that is being waged throughout the whole world in order to maintain this idea of full spectrum dominance, that this one country has to dominate every aspect of life, from the economy to the political to the sea domain and the air domain and the space domain, and they just have to dominate everything. And that's all connected to the US dollar being the world's main reserve currency, which it has been since World War II, the last time this massive cycle of destruction was unleashed upon the world. And there are people who benefit greatly from that, primarily the central bankers, who then have the godlike ability to create infinite value by creating currency out of nothing, and then that currency can be used to purchase pretty much anything. So it's a system of financial slavery. And obviously, the slave masters, those in the central positions of the empire, do have the incentive and the training and everything and the motivation to unleash war, which the primary reason that wars happen is for financial reasons and for power, money, dominance, and finance is just a means to achieve power, essentially. Because those who control the printing presses, obviously, they don't place the value in the dollar. They place the value in how they can control all the resources of the planet via the dollar. So this has gone on for many decades, more than a half century, and if you go back to the previous system, for centuries, because the current system is connected to the old system of the British, and that's connected to the previous system, and it all goes back to the Catholic Church, and then it goes back to religions and everything, but just systems of control, and it's basically treated as an art form of how to control the masses to be the predator amongst the species, as opposed to being one of the species, to be the controller, the leader, the ruler of the species. So I mean, you could go all the way back to Babylon or Sumeria, where these ideas that people aren't all equal kind of originate, as these power-hungry psychopaths basically control populations through force and threats, and then also kind of cunning tools and manipulation and everything. So the main reason why this war is going on with Russia and the U.S. and NATO in Ukraine is for those same financial reasons. That Western Europe was too dependent upon Russia and their energy, and the U.S. didn't like that. They want them to be they want their full spectrum dominance, so they've got to bring Russia down. And I've talked about this in my last videos. Before the whole war started, I basically outlined why this has to happen. For the dollar to maintain its dominance, they have to create a conflict with Russia, because that's just how the system works. So I mean, it's no surprise, and you can go back to past videos of how months, if not years, before the conflict broke out. Well, the conflict really broke out in 2014, so it's not really, a lot of people just think it broke out in 2022. But anyways, so what do I really want to say about it? Well, we're already up to the point where there's hundreds of thousands dead, and thousands, if not tens of thousands, mostly Ukrainians, because that's the whole strategy, is fight to the last Ukrainian. And then there's thousands or tens of thousands of NATO soldiers, as well as Russian soldiers that have already been killed, and they continue to escalate. It's ongoing escalations. When there's a potential for peace, then the U.S. and their British allies step in and say there will be no peace, there will be only war. But the U.S. has to do the same thing with China, essentially. For the same reason that they had to create warfare with Russia, they have to create warfare with China in order to protect their dominance, or they have to fold, essentially. And given the past track record, it's more likely that they'll exacerbate the conflict. So it's not a good sort of theme, because war is destructive, and it causes mass loss of life. But if you look at it from a purely economic perspective, it's all in the interests of the United States, which is one of the reasons I don't want to be involved with that empire of death and destruction and military-industrial complex and financial slavery, and why I'm doing all this, and to de-dollarize my own life and be sustainable off-grid. Because eventually, from my perspective, the dollar will fail. It's just a matter of time. And I think it's most likely that the U.S. will end up folding, because they'll lose all their support, and the dollar will be losing its value. And even though it might look like it's gaining value versus like the basket of currencies of the euro and the pound and the yen, they'll all be just going down, and the actual real value of what is actually produced is increasing in the other countries. And that's not to mention that there's a whole block of countries that are working together to create a competing currency system with the dollar that will be in their own best interest. The BRICS, and then the new development bank, and all these regional currencies and bilateral trade agreements and everything that inevitably will lead to what's called a multipolar world, as opposed to a one party dominating full spectrum everything. There will be regional powers that will have their own spheres of dominance in their own ways, and hopefully a lot more cooperation and a lot less unilateral imposition of rules and force and just extraction of resources and wealth from all of these various places, which only benefits one party. So cooperative symbiotic relations, instead of the current system, which not only leaves much of the world in poverty and starving, but isn't in the best interest of even the people in the United States, because the culture here is completely degraded, the actual productivity is degraded, the values, the moral system, the integrity is all degraded, and the leaders are basically these corrupt, senile imbeciles, and that's who's promoted to these leadership positions in democracy. So my hope is obviously that there will be peace, but it seems more likely that there will be more escalations of warfare until such time as basically, if it's like a poker game, it's like each side is raising. At some point you have to show your hand, and the warfare is essentially showing the hand. So as they're literally running out of Ukrainians to send to the front lines, because there's been over, from different accounts, from 150 to maybe over 200,000 Ukrainians dead already. And then they're also running out of their crap equipment from like decades ago that they can just send to Ukraine, because they're just sending all the old equipment to Ukraine. And they don't really want to send the new equipment to Ukraine, because they figure if they're going to hold this position, they're going to have to use that equipment against Russia on their own. And why would they want to give their good equipment to the untrained Ukrainians, who at this point they're recruiting like teenagers and elderly and women and everything, because they've run out of the majority of their able-bodied men to sacrifice on the altar of war. So most likely, as the war continues, the war of attrition that was meant to degrade Russia is actually being kind of more unsustainable for the Western powers, because Russia is actually more geared towards that culturally and historically, and industrially as well. And there's a limit of how far they can push it, because they don't. Neither side wants to go nuclear, but they also want to achieve their objectives by pushing it as far as they can without going nuclear. Well, maybe not Russia, but Russia will continue to escalate even all the way to nuclear, because for them it's an existential crisis, and for the West, for everyone other than Ukraine, it's not an existential crisis. And but the U.S. wants to create the impression for the rest of Europe that it is an existential crisis, so they can get Europe to sacrifice itself to fight against Russia. And so it's like a tactical retreat in a way, so that the U.S.'s enemy, in a sense, or main military nuclear competitor, Russia, will be degraded through the U.S.'s vassals in Europe, and then the U.S. can pivot towards China once Europe is pot committed and they can't possibly not continue to fight with Russia. And then the U.S. pivots towards China, which is actually much more dangerous, because the scale of China's economy and military and everything leaves it in a situation where the U.S. can't necessarily do the same strategy against China that they did against Russia. But they have a greater nuclear dominance over China, and they might think that they can just go nuclear with China, whereas they can't really with Russia. But most likely what I think is actually going to happen is that they're going to it's basically just going to all go bankrupt at some point. But they're going to push it as far as they can. They're going to defend it as far as they can until it's no longer in their interest to continually escalate these wars. And then the U.S. will eventually kind of just pull back and focus on its own kind of. Basically, the empire will turn in on itself and kind of do the same tactics that they've done throughout the rest of the world against the American population. So the Americans, instead of being the kind of seemingly beneficiaries of all this domination and extortion, will be the ones who are dominated and extorted to a degree that they have not seen, and they've just heard about in Nazi Germany, basically. And all of the people who aren't the brainwashed masses that go along with that centralized system will be the undesirables, who will be just like the unvaccinated people, who will be ultimately ostracized, prevented from engaging in the economy, and then eventually kind of rounded up, and there will be a final solution for those people. That's the most likely kind of outcome, but even that the ability to do that is reliant upon, it's a balance of forces, and there's they might be able to trick the majority of people in urban centers, but the country folk who live outside of the urban areas aren't really going to go along with that. And so most likely at some point this whole house of cards is going to collapse, and at that point supply chains break down. This thing that people have treated as money, which is really just currency because it has no intrinsic value, the dollar, and all of the financial assets which are built upon the dollar will all become valueless. Not just worth less, but worth nothing. And then that will be the big reality that will slap the Americans in the face, and those who thought they were wealthy will realize they were poor, and those who have been living meekly and sustainably and have actual survival skills will inherit the earth or the country. So I don't know how much of an update that is, other than just kind of giving my perspective on all of that. But just I guess another kind of thing that's coming soon, or everyone's talking about it, just like everyone's talking about that the U.S. economy is going to collapse soon because they raise all these interest rates so fast and so high that all of these people who got used to the zero interest rate policy are stuck in a position where they're not going to be able to sustain their lifestyle, and all of these, like the housing sector and various sectors, which are all these inflated bubbles, are going to pop. Unless they reinflate it with another round of stimulus, which is what they've done in the past. But in the past, they haven't had the inflation at the current level, so it's likely they're trying to get the inflation down before they infuse another round of inflation. Money printing, there's different definitions of inflation, whether it's the money supply or the prices. So people kind of think differently about what that word actually means, and I kind of used it in both ways there, so that's kind of confusing. But anyways, just to wrap this up, and then the last thing is, so Russia is amassed all these troops around Ukraine, and supposedly they're going to do a big offensive soon, but it's not guaranteed. They could be using that as a strategy to just demonstrate that, no, this whole narrative that Ukraine is going to win this war is just impossible, essentially, because the forces are so imbalanced. And the technology and everything is just so imbalanced between them, and it's mostly a psychological war. And it's really fascinating to see how brainwashed and deluded the majority of the masses are, because they only get one side of the story. And that's another trend, is just the censorship and everything that is necessary in order to ensure that the truth doesn't get out there, and that only the propaganda reaches the information. I guess in summary, it's likely to get worse before it gets better, but I do think it will end up getting better, and I don't think it will get to the scale of the last World War, for a number of reasons, but I could be wrong. I just hopefully I'm not. So I think that is about the end of this video update. The weather has been really strangely warm and right in the middle of winter, very unseasonable. I think that's probably related to the weather warfare going on, which is also in relation to the wider war going on. And if you're not aware of all the technologies that enable that and have been around for decades, then you can do a little bit of research about exactly how the weather warfare is done. But we don't need to get into that now. And I think in the last video I talked about this kind of microdosing of mushrooms that I was doing. So I did that up until the peak of winter, I guess, which was, from my perspective, was February 8th. And of every day, and that was great for a number of reasons, just for overall health. And now I'm on a more of a every other day type cycle, and I'm just going with the seasons for that. And the food sustainability situation here, it has gotten a lot better, where I would say more than 50% of the food that I eat at this point, or at least 50%, is sustainable. But I really only have to spend probably less than $5 a day on food. On average, probably closer to about $3 a day on food. And then the goal is to get to the point where I don't need to spend any dollars a day on food. Or I could barter for food if I have to with the various assets that I've saved up. And then when we get to that point, when the dollar becomes valueless, hopefully that I will not only be able to sustain myself and all the animals here, but other people as well, depending on the carrying capacity and the success of everything going on here. And you, viewer, if you want, if you maybe like the idea of what's going on here, but you might not be in a position to do something similar, you can support what's going on here and help to basically invest in that outcome of people thriving outside of the dollar and finding decentralized off-grid solutions. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. The build videos will begin again in April or May, and I'll probably have one more video that I put out before then, kind of like at the end of the winter. And that's all for now. Take care. Ugh.